In his short story, The Library of Babel, Jorge Luis Borges is going to give us a narrator, and we could even say speculator, since a lot of the things that he's saying are purportedly either historical or philosophical, but we're not quite sure how reliable this narrator is, who belongs to what we could call the orthodoxy of the world of the library. Now, how widespread this is, we don't really know, in part because there's suggestions that if you go just, a couple miles in one direction or up, 90 stories within the library, people are vastly different. So the authorities who are mentioned, the Orthodox, it's not quite clear how much area they actually control. But the narrator is one of them. And what we want to look at are some of the non-orthodox, the heterodox, the heretical that are being referenced and discussed, because what those do is provide us with interpretations of the library, its books, of language, of the universe. So the first thing I think we should take a look at is 3 examples of different kinds of books and thereby different kinds of people or hexagons that are being imagined and sought after. So the first one that we hear about is a circular chamber. Now, this is being revealed by mystics in their ecstasies that have revealed to them a circular chamber containing an enormous circular book with a continuous spine that goes completely around the walls. And that's tough even just to picture. How would it even be a book? And he says their testimony is suspect, their words obscure. That cyclical book is God. And so that's being rejected by the narrator. And then we find out that there are other people who are being actually identified as belonging to sects or cults, and they are going to bring up other interesting ideas. So one of these is the crimson hexagon, right? So people are spurred on by this holy zeal to reach someday through unrelenting effort the books of the crimson hexagon. How are these books different? They're smaller than natural books being the normal books of the library. And these books are omnipotent, illustrated, and magical. Okay, so illustrated is the easiest part to wrap our head around. They have images, pictures, illustrations, whatever we want to call them. And the other books don't. The other books are simply characters. But what would it mean for these books to be magical? Well, perhaps they have powers, or they contain incantations. We don't really know. And then the strangest adjective is omnipotent. How would a book be omnipotent? We're not given any explanation. And then we move on very shortly after that to this interesting conjecture. It's a superstition, right? Belief in what was termed the bookman. Now, the bookman is going to be somebody in a special hexagon. On some shelf in some hexagon, it was argued there must exist a book that is the cipher and perfect compendium of all other books, and some librarian must have examined that book. This librarian is analogous to a god. In the language of this zone, there are still vestiges of the sect that worshipped that distant librarian. Many have gone in search of him. For 100 years, men beat every possible path and every path in vain. And there's even an interesting suggestion how you might actually find him. Someone proposed searching by regression to locate book A, consult book B, which tells her book A can be found, to locate book B, consult book C, and so to infinity. And the narrator actually tells us, it is in ventures such as these I have squandered and spent my years. I cannot think it unlikely there is such a total book on some shelf in the universe. I pray to the unknown God. Some man, even a single man, tens of centuries ago, has perused and read that book, right? There's a footnote here. Borges does like to put footnotes in some of his stories. I repeat, in order for a book to exist, it is sufficient that it is possible. Only the impossible is excluded. For example, no book is also a staircase, although there are no doubt books that discuss and deny and prove that possibility, and others whose structure corresponds to that of a staircase. So, a book that would give you the key to all the other books. The narrator dismisses these first two, talks about this as a superstition, and then admits that he has actually given up part of his life for that. Then we get another very interesting discussion, which has to do with these theoretical books called the Vindications. These would be books of apologiae, that is, justifications, and prophecies that would vindicate for all time the actions of every person in the universe and that held wondrous arcana for men's futures. And he tells us that thousands of greedy individuals abandoned their sweet native hexagons and rushed upstairs, spurred by the vain desire to find their vindication. So this is why they're greedy and selfish. They're not interested in the good of the library or the culture as such. They're interested just in finding their vindication. They squabbled in the narrow corridors, muttered dark imprecations, strangled one another on the divine staircases, threw deceiving volumes down ventilation shafts, were themselves hurled to their deaths by men of distant regions. Others went insane. And now it's interesting because the narrator says, I've actually seen two vindications. No idea who they apply to, seem to be future people. So they do exist. But the odds of you actually finding your vindication is pretty bad. He says the chance of a man's finding his vindication or some perfidious version of his own, a deceptive version that's not really his vindication, can be calculated to be 0. So we get another group, right? And then we get some discussions of what we can call sects or cults. These are unorthodox. And there's some interesting discussions here. So we're going to find that there are like traces of some of these, right? So he says that one blasphemous sect proposed searches among the library's volumes be discontinued and that all men shuffle letters and symbols until those canonical books, through some improbable stroke of chance, had been constructed. The authorities were forced to issue strict orders. The sect disappeared, but in my childhood, I have seen old men who for long periods would hide in the latrines with metal discs and a forbidden dice cup, feebly mimicking the divine disorder. So that's one group. And then we get the purifiers, who are a little bit more, not organized, but prevalent, we could say. These thought the first thing to do was to eliminate all worthless books. They would invade the hexagons, show credentials that were not always false, leaf disgustedly through a volume, condemn entire walls of books. It is to their hygienic, ascetic rage that we lay the senseless lost of millions of volumes. Their name is execrated today, but those who grieve over the treasures overlook too widely acknowledged facts. They couldn't really do any real damage, the purifiers. Why? Because the library is so huge, any reduction by human hands must be infinitesimal. So, they're not ruining that much even if they destroy 1 million volumes. Second, each book is unique and irreplaceable, but because the library is total, there are always several 100,000 imperfect facsimiles, books that differ by no more than a single letter or a comma. So, as he says, the depredations that these people inflicted on the library, really quite minor. Moving on, we have, he says, infidels, right? So, heterodox, who claim that the rule in the library is not sense but nonsense. and that rationality, even humble, pure coherence, is an almost miraculous exception. They speak, I know, of the feverish library, whose random volumes constantly threaten to transmogrify into others, so that they affirm all things, deny all things, and confound and confuse all things, like some mad and hallucinating deity. So these words, he says, which not only proclaim disorder but exemplify it as well, prove the infidels' deplorable taste and desperate ignorance. And this is where the narrator is going to say, actually, every single book has meaning. There is no nonsense. It's just a matter of being able to decipher it, which unfortunately we're largely incapable of. And then the last group that he mentions, which I don't know if you can actually call it a cult or a sect, is people who live a good ways away. And he tells that there are districts in which the young people prostrate themselves before books and like savages kiss their pages, though they cannot read a letter. In a way, they're unaware of what books really are supposed to be. So they turn them into these holy objects, and that's it for them. Now, what does this ultimately lead to? A great disorder. At the very end, he says, the human race is decimated in population, and the human species teeters at the verge of extinction. Why is that? Well, because they've had centuries of epidemics, heretical discords, that is, fighting between people, pilgrimages that inevitably degenerate into brigandage. So pilgrims go seeking something, and sooner or later get into fighting with the peoples whose hexagons they have invaded, essentially. And there's also suicides. So the rate of suicide is going up. It looks pretty bad for human beings in the story. And why is this? Well, a lot of it is spurred by the need for figuring out what exactly the library is, what these books are, what we human beings can do with them. So interpretation, there are myriad interpretations possible. Some of them take on the status of cults or sects, and none of them provide answers that are total and conclusive. And so what we have is this vast, vast collection of books and a lot of contradictory ideas about what they actually could mean.